Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our regular Zoom meeting. Um, we wouldn't be anywhere without our membership. And I think it's really crucial for us that whenever we have meetings, if we have to face those officials from wherever, they usually ask, how many members you've got, that kind of stuff. So we like to be able to say we've got enough numbers to worry them. But of course, we've also fortunate to have many trade unions supporting our fight for reparations. So we've got those back in. But membership is important. And I think, especially in these times, our meeting today addresses immigration, which has been on the news almost every day for the last months. We've had a very hot summer of activities with fascists on the street. I think in the world we're facing a rise in fascism, fueled by the American president and some of his right-hand people who were making Nazi salutes on television. Um, Throughout Europe, there's a rise in fascism, even some governments openly fascist. Here in the UK, we are facing, I think, a perfect storm, as it were, in rise in racism for the next upcoming elections. I've been through several elections in this country, and I've never experienced it as terrible as it is at the moment. It's very clear there's a project of creating a hostile environment for not only for migrants and refugees, but for all Black people living in this country. It will affect each one of us. When we are attacked in the streets because of the kind of messages that people are picking up that we're not wanted in this country, and that is clearly the message they're putting out, creating a hostile environment so people will not want to come. It's just feeding into the far right agenda. There's already been attacks on people, on Black people, all over the country and all ages. I've heard of a 9-year-old being shot with air gun pellets, um, pensioners attacked in a park, and I'm sure there's many stories we won't hear about. But we know the environment they're creating is not safe for us. And this is why organization is important. We've been trying to take this issue a lot more seriously than we've done in the past. We've joined many of the anti-fascist demonstrations. The big one on the 13th, we were nearly kettled in Whitehall. We just managed to leave 15 minutes before people were actually kettled. And it was a wake-up call, really, for all of us, because the anti-fascists and anti-Nazi League, Stand Up to Racism, have done a fantastic job of opposing the racists, the far right, for generations. But we were really taken back this time because we were well outnumbered. Maybe 20,000 maximum we put on the streets. And the far right had 140,000, according to some figures, 150,000. I say these things because many people in the Caribbean or in the US or outside of London, they're not aware of it. But this is the atmosphere we're living in at the moment. Where I live, 5 minutes walk down the road is a Thistle Hotel. I never thought I'd have to be fighting the fascists in my backyard. But I was out there with our banner, with some CLS executive members attended some of the demonstrations. The attack on the hotel that housed the mainly Somali migrants was continuous. About 3-4 times we had to be out there to defend them. And only last Sunday again, we were out there because someone had tried to set a fire to the hotel. So we know it's dangerous time for all of us in the UK. So we need to be taking this fascism very seriously. And one of the ways it's being legitimized in some way is the attack on migrants, and immigration is the issue that is fueling much of this. So that's why we felt it was important that we have this meeting today. We've got two really excellent and experienced speakers on this today, and I'll introduce them separately before we begin. But before I start, in case there's any executive members with any reports they would like to give in, I know there's been one apology from not an executive member, but David, who usually is a regular at our meetings, David Horsley, is unable to attend. Is there anything else we needed to add at this moment? If not, okay. We should begin with Nadine Finch, who has been a long-time supporter of CLS. I've known her for at least nearly as long as I've been in this country. That my first contact, I think, was after your trip, Nadine, as a Labour councillor, I think, to Guyana. And you all came up with a little booklet, Why Guyana is Dying, I think, if I remember the title rightly. And since then, you know, numerous contacts politically and otherwise. You left the Labour Party, went on to train as a lawyer, barrister, I'm not sure which is the right term, and you've continued to be a serious person in terms of the work that we do here in the UK. And being a member of CLS, we're very pleased to invite you to take the floor now. Nadine.
Thanks very much, Luke. And yeah, we did go back a way. I wasn't actually a Labour councillor, but I was on a sort of delegation to Grenada, and we did a side trip to Guyana. And I actually got arrested for taking a photo of a food queue, because of course Burnham didn't want to admit there were any food queues or any problems with water. So we got arrested and taken to a local station. I was a barrister for about 25 years, working in immigration and public law. And then I was also a judge for about 15 years in the immigration tribunals. And that's kind of, in some ways, my entry point to what I'm going to say today, because I have worked in that sector for 35 years. And I have to say, at no point, and the system isn't perfect, never has been perfect, but there was space then to protect the rights of asylum seekers and migrants. But that space has been incredibly reduced by a series of governments. I have to say, I think the present government is reducing it fastest and the most stringently. Over the years, politicians have talked to the migrant organisations and the NGOs. This government really only talks to the Home Office, who've always seen themselves as gatekeepers to repel migrants from abroad. And I feel, to a certain extent, we're rather a rivers of blood moment, because both the government and the far right outside Parliament are relying on implicitly racist rhetoric, ignoring international law, and also misusing migration statistics. Some of you will have seen the pamphlet that Steve and Tony and I put together. And in that, I was talking about the white paper that came out in May, which is called Restoring Control to the Immigration System. And actually, the title says it all. What I'm going to do today is try and take you through some further developments that have happened. Now, during the summer and during recess, the government has amended some immigration rules based on what they said in the white paper. And they're able to do that because immigration rules are a strange kind of parliamentary sort of legislation, because you don't have to go through a committee stage or report stage in Parliament to change the rules. You just have to lay them in front of Parliament, and it's a very cursory affirmative stage. But what's interesting is that at Labour Party conference last week, we got lots of hints about how they're going to fulfill other things they said in the white paper, some of which will need legislation, some of which they can just amend the rules for. And I think the Labour Party conference, if anybody watched it, I'm no longer a member and I wasn't there, but I watched bits on the TV. watch on YouTube. It was noteworthy for the waving of Union Jacks and St George's flags and the multiple references by many ministers to the need to protect Britain's borders, streets and workplaces from foreigners. And there was a lot of talk about street crime as well as repelling the boats. And I think it was indicative of a really racist attitude, not just to migrants, but to the communities they lived in. Now, of course, this government has 412 places in Parliament out of 65, but it only had 33.7% of the popular vote. It is acutely aware that it has critics to the right and critics to the left, but it's particularly the critics to the right that they are concentrating on, and particularly reform. And the government's pollsters and spin doctors have turned incredibly hard right in terms of immigration and asylum policies, principally because they're not prepared to spend the money needed to prop up the declining public services that everybody is crying out for from the left and the right. So soaring prices, privatised services, lack of access to good quality medical and social care and public housing, few opportunities to train. These were not addressed at the conference. The most we got was a pledge for digital GP appointments and increase in technical education. Instead, the theme throughout the conference was how to decrease the number of migrants and repel them from the borders. Now, Keir's speech was actually very carefully crafted, and actually his delivery was actually better than usual. And he referred to Britain as a beautiful, tolerant and diverse country that welcomed refugees. But he couldn't resist referring to refugees as those who were truly fleeing persecution, and saying that a diverse country was only possible if its borders were secure. He ended the speech by saying, with flags in our hands, the government would renew the country. Now, this will auto reminiscent for me and Luke and those who live in Islington of the many St George's flags and Union Jacks hanging from lampposts in the south of the borough and pavements and roundabouts painted with St George's flags. But Keir left it to his ministers to actually bring in the details about migration. In her speech, Shabana Mahmood, who is now the Home Secretary, drew a distinction between Labour's patriotism and the so-called Reform's ethno-nationalism. In my view, that was a distinction without any difference. The core of her view was that the balance between human rights and secure borders was not in the right place at the moment. She distrusted the European Convention on Human Rights and also judges. Yvette Cooper, now the Foreign Secretary, used her speech to promise that there'd be no new return hubs for asylum seekers outside the country, more border controls, measures to defeat trafficking and smuggling gangs, and a review of the Refugee Convention. All this was based on a characterisation of asylum seekers as illegal entrants, a racist trope inherited from the Tories but happily continued by this government. Sometimes I'm going to mention law because I was a lawyer, but until 222, asylum seekers were granted temporary admission whilst their application is determined. They were not illegal entrants. Under the Refugee Convention, they were given temporary admission so that their application could be determined. It's only that act which referred to them and characterised them as illegal entrants. Some 47% of those who applied for asylum in 2024 were granted protection by the Home Office, and around 33% of those who weren't granted protection at first instance were then granted protection after an appeal. So to call those people in the small boats across the channel as illegal entrants or as bogus asylum seekers is very, very far from the truth. I was talking about the characterization of asylum seekers illegal entrants, and I was saying there were no safe routes to asylum. The government claims there are, but actually only something like little over 7,000 people's got in on the safe routes. And to get on a safe route, you have to be in a refugee camp or similar somewhere, and you have to be nominated by UNHCR. There are no safe routes, which is why people come in small boats. The main trajectory of this government really is to respond to reform and to lower the number of people coming in. And I'll come back to the stats in a minute. But one of the first things they've done is to say that all refugees can no longer bring any wives or children in after they get asylum. That used to be the case for adults, not for children. But now they're going to leave those women and children to languish in tents in the desert or hiding from the Taliban in Afghanistan or something similar. Now, the Attorney General doesn't speak at the Labour Party conference, but he was speaking at Finch meetings, and he was also making clear that the government believed that the current case law and policy guidance on Article 8 hampered the government's ability to stop the boats coming and protect the UK's wider interests. Therefore, the government was pretty organised in its rebuffal of migrant rights. Now, as you said in the leaflet I referred to, of course, workers have propped up, workers in British colonies and elsewhere have propped up the British state for years and years, and they continue to do so, as anybody who ever goes in a hospital understands, or goes on a bus or a train or in a prison or many other workplaces. Now, historically, those people weren't treated as guest workers as they do in Germany. They were expected to integrate into the community and remain here working on a long-term basis. It appears that this is changing. Earlier this year, the government announced that care workers and others on the health and social care skilled worker visas couldn't bring in partners. And now they've actually closed the whole scheme altogether. In her conference speech, the Home Secretary said that 700,000 people had come in under that scheme. That's a bit deceptive because some of those people will have been their partners and children. But she also claimed it had been abused and used by people who then disappeared into the economy. This is somewhat of a distortion because the Public Accounts Committee report on the scheme in July of this year noticed there were some abuse and misuse of the system, but that was by the sponsor companies. It wasn't on the whole by the workers themselves. It also noted that these workers had been a positive response to the shortage of workers caused by the COVID crisis. And they noted the government had not assessed the consequences of stopping this overseas recruitment. And of course, these people are those that prop up the very poor quality of service we offer to our elderly. Other changes to conditions in the white paper have been brought in even more rapidly. There's something like 1,000 prison officers, a lot of whom were recruited from Africa, have recently lost their jobs because the government changed the nature of the requirement, the financial requirement for continuing as prison officers. So they came in on one level, then they were told they could only stay if they made 41,700 a year. Of course, many of them did not, so therefore they lost their job and were asked to leave the country. The same thing has happened to something like 300 what's termed rail travel assistance to the people who work in stations. And RMT and TSSA have been protesting outside the Home Office about this. The interesting thing is that actually migrants are a bit of a money spinner for the government, as opposed to costing money. So every migrant has to pay £1,000 a year for NHS surcharge. And since 2015, the government has earned 6.9 million from those surcharges. As the people coming in on these visas are on the whole young and fit, no way did they cost the NHS that amount of money. Applications for visas also vary between about 700 and 1,700, and that's a net gain to the Home Office in particular. Now, the Reform Party, you probably heard, intends to stop indefinite leave to remain, and that's clearly been a real worry for many in the community. And Luke's talked about the migrant community being at risk, as well as people who are applying for visas. Now, in the white paper, it just said they were looking at raising the time you had to spend here from 5 years to 10 years. In her speech in conference, the Home Secretary put much more detail on that. So if you do manage to remain here for 10 years in your job, you have to meet 6 other conditions. You have to show you've been in work throughout that time. You've been making national insurance and tax contributions, that you're able to speak English to a high standard, that you've not committed any criminal offences. Misusing statistics. Home Secretary, again, I keep on talking about it, but she was really the most remarkable, said that 2.6 million people had arrived in Britain between 2021 and 2024. The implication being that many of those were illegal or not wanted. What she failed to note was since 2022, some 2,690,000 Ukrainians have been granted entry and permitted to work, obtain housing, and remain for political reasons. Some 204,000 British national overseas citizens have come in from Hong Kong, again for political reasons on the same basis. And since 2018, 4.2 million EU citizens have got a settlement here. I was actually quite shocked by that number as a result of Brexit. In contrast, some 33,556 asylum seekers arrived in 2024 by small boats. Majority of them from places that clearly qualified them for asylum: Afghanistan, Eritrea, Syria, Sudan, Yemen, Iran. There's also a narrative that the UK is a soft touch of the Council of Europe. In fact, that's not the case. 180,000 migrants entered the EU by boat in 2024, mainly through Italy, Spain, and Greece. I'll just quickly refer to leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, a favourite claim of both Conservatives and Reform now. Now, the Attorney General has made clear that they will not be leaving the ECHR, principally because if they leave the ECHR, they won't be able to return migrants to many other countries. There'll be no one-in, one-out deal with France. They'll also be thrown out of the Council of Europe, a 42-country body, which deals with return of prisoners, adoption, care proceedings, anti-trafficking measures, some other pseudo-military measures, abducted children. And anyway, if they were expelled from the Council of Europe, which would be the consequence of leaving the ECHR, they'd be in a club. The only other members were Russia and Belarus. So it's clear they're not going to leave the ECHR, but other statements by ministers make it clear they are going to tinker around with the Human Rights Act, and particularly Article 8 of the ECHR, to reduce the right to family and private life for migrants. Another worrying thing that I found on a House of Lords site was that the person who's now the Home Secretary, when she was Lord Chancellor, boasts of working with 42 other Council of Europe states to try and reduce and amend the Council of European Convention on Human Rights. Now, she's working with only 9 other Council of Europe states out of 42, but it's the nature of those states that causes me concern. This move to amend the convention is headed up by the Italian and Danish governments, very, very anti-migrant governments, and they're supported by right-wing governments such as Austria, Czech Republic, and Poland. I think that indicates where this government is prepared to go and what allies it's prepared to go in anti-migrant rhetoric. Just lastly, the judges, of course, are a problem for this government because whatever people think of some of the judges, they do on the whole maintain the law. And I know from being a judge that some of the judges do not necessarily agree with some of the case law, but they do understand they have to follow it. So on the 24th of August, the government announced a new independent body sitting apart from the Immigration and Courts and Tribunal Service, made up of independent, professionally trained adjudicators to clear the asylum backlog, accelerate returns, and close the hotels. Now, they will replace the professionally trained judges in the first-tier tribunal system. It doesn't appear to me that they will be held to the duties under the Human Rights Act to uphold the European Convention on Human Rights. And it's very unclear to me what training they'll have. One judge still working the system tells me he thinks they'll be recruited in the same way as lay magistrates. All of this, of course, undercuts Keir Starmer's celebration of a tolerant and diverse country. Thanks, Steve. I'm glad.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm back. I logged out and found it very difficult to log back in. Apologies to everyone for that fiasco, and hopefully we'll have systems in place to make sure those kind of things don't happen. It's not the first meeting it's happened to. Another black meeting I know about that had the same problem. And some of you might have heard the racism at the beginning of it, where he said he hates black people or something. So we know the fascists and the racists are trying to stop us from talking, stop us from meeting, stop us from organizing. And this is why it's so important we keep mobilizing to fight. It reminds me of the notice that went out just before the 13th when they had the racist anti-immigrant demonstration. That notice was sent around to many black people. I received it. I'm not sure where it came from, but warning black people, not to go out on that day because the fascists were in town. The exact response we don't want to do. We have to be out there confronting, and this is why I applaud the anti-fascist movement, the anti-Nazi movement, Stand Up to Racism, the many that have been going out week after week opposing. What is lacking is more black people in those demonstrations, and this is why we were determined to have CLS banner out there to show that there's representation. Several EC members were on the banner, behind the banner, and we need to mobilize black people in the UK to begin to stand up to this racism. So I encourage everybody who lives in London or lives in the UK either to encourage people to come out when there's these anti-fascists, whenever the fascists are on the street and there's an anti-fascist demonstration. Contact us, join with us. We will be out there with our banner. Okay, we lost some minutes there for our meeting. I'm sure. Actually, we'll have the next speaker first, and then we'll take all the questions together. So, Jackie, if you're there, I know you had a problem logging in as well. Are you there with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. Hi, Jackie. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. No, it was just before the meeting that I had the problem. It's a secure management system.
Let me introduce you first. I know there was a sentence put out there. It's unusual for me to have two old friends and people who go back a long time on the same meeting. Jackie, I know for maybe 40 years as well, but I won't give away your age, Jackie, but I've been around a long time. She was the treasurer of CLS at one time and chief bottle washer. I put it because I don't know what she wasn't organizing. Obviously, fantastic at organizing. She went on to train to became a publisher. She's also a lawyer, and we know that amazing work you've done with the Windrush generation in supporting people to get the benefits. You've received many accolades. I won't try to list them or we'll be here all day, I know. So if there's anything else you want to add, please do, and then we'll have your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luke, and good afternoon, everybody. God, that was really quite extraordinary, but you're absolutely right. It's very common because it happened in Dr. Drayton's meeting with Juanita Cox recently when they were looking at DRACs on reparations. We had exactly the same thing. So that's the new tactic. I don't know what we do about it. Nadine and I sort of had a short exchange yesterday, and Nadine said, and I saw the paper that yourself, Steve, Tony, and Nadine had written, dealing with some bits of the white paper and dealing with some of the statistics. And I thought that we would end up probably saying pretty much the same things because I'm a practitioner. And the white paper is very central to everything that we're looking at the moment. So I thought I would come at this very differently, actually, and look, focusing on the Windrush scandal a bit, and looking at the role that race plays in everything that we see happening now. Because one of the glaringly absent things, I think, from the discussions on immigration and asylum in the UK at the moment, and particularly anything that's said in a pejorative way or anything that's done, is that it's underpinned by racism. But we very rarely hear this in any discussion. Even on the left, you can hear, full-length speeches in meetings, in fringe meetings, without the word being used once. And I find that really interesting because the reason why we're discussing this is to work out what are we supposed to be doing. And unless we understand what's really going on, other than that we're having these changes to legislation and policy and rules, then I don't know that we can really come up with an effective game plan. And even so, even if we were to put racism in the center of the discussion, we're still going to have a big struggle to know what to do, because those who oppose migrants, those who oppose people who are non-white, are very well resourced and very well organized, and certainly much more than those who don't. And we can find examples of how UK immigration policy and racism are intertwined, but as I only have 20 minutes and possibly less, given that rude incursion, I thought I'd start with the Windrush scandal, whose very origins emanate from 30 years of racist immigration legislation designed to do one thing, which is to reduce the UK's non-white population. Very few in this forum will have been surprised by the findings in the historical roots of the Windrush scandal report. in which the unnamed author describes how the British Empire depended on racist ideology in order to function, which he says informed the immigration laws passed in the post-war period. He concluded that the origins of the deep-rooted racism of the Windrush scandal lie in the fact that during the period 1950 to 1981, every single piece of immigration or citizenship legislation was designed, at least in part, to reduce the number of people with black or brown skin who were able to live in the UK. And as a result, the experiences of Britain's black communities, of the Home Office and of the law and of life in the UK have been fundamentally different from those of white communities. The report states, I just need to look at some notes here because I need to actually quote what it states rather than just speak. The report states major immigration legislation in 1962, 1968 and 1968. And I would actually add the British Nationality Act of 1981, the Borders Act of 2007, and all the legislation we've seen that came through the period known as the hostile environment was designed to reduce the proportion of people living in the United Kingdom who did not have white skin. And he writes, the British Empire depended on racist ideology to function, which in turn produced legislation aimed at keeping racial and ethnic groups apart. From the beginning, concern about Commonwealth immigration was really concern about skin colour. In the 1950s, British officials shared a basic assumption that what they described as coloured migrants, as they referred to us, were not good enough for British society. What we do know about this report is that Dr. James Southern of Queen Mary University was commissioned to write it, that his name appeared in very early editions, and that the Home Office went to great lengths to suppress it, with it only coming to light after legal action was taken. And some of you might recall that Diane Abbott tried to get the report released through the Home Affairs Select Committee and failed to do that. And her statement then was that the Home Affairs / British government were unwilling to acknowledge the racism that has disfigured British immigration policy for decades. We know the history, and CLS has looked extensively at the Windrush scandal, but it is worth a quick restating to understand where we are today and the sole reason why we are where we are today. We know that World War II had caused a huge shortage of labour and that people were needed to assist the crumbling transport infrastructure and staff the newly created NHS. We hear this repeatedly in any introduction to a discussion about the Windrush scandal. What we know less of is that the initial appeal for workers was actually directed to white Europeans, the Irish, German and Italian prisoners of war, refugees from Eastern Europe, and so on. At the same time, large numbers of white Britons were migrating to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, who themselves had labour shortages. And so Britain was kind of forced to look to the black and brown empire, and found, interestingly, we see in the literature, people from the Caribbean to be a bit more palatable. And I think more work has to be done on why they thought that. You know, is it that they thought we were more docile or subservient? I have no idea, but it is, I'm fascinated by that finding. But this development caused much concern, posited as a fear that the new arrivals might be discriminated against. So it was almost like, oh, let's have some sympathy for them because they're going to be discriminated against. But really, what was really going on, it was to preserve the essence of white British identity. So when, on the 22nd of June 1948, which will be familiar to all of you as the date the Windrush ship arrived, or the ship actually arrived the day before, 11 Labour Party members of Parliament sent to the then Prime Minister Clement Attlee a letter which opposed the arrival of the Windrush ship which is why people came off it the following day, and which claimed that an influx of coloured people, their words, domiciled in Britain was likely to impair the harmony and cohesion of our public and social life, and to cause unhappiness amongst all concerned. The words we see in the literature of yesterday, lack of community cohesion, different cultures, different people, reflect the language of today, emanating from nearly every political sphere. Nevertheless, for economic reasons only, the British Nationality Act 1948 was enacted for the provision of British citizenship for people who lived in the colonies, despite efforts to end the free movement of those very same people. And when people started arriving from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka between 1950 and 1960, or the 60s, the concern about the numbers of non-white population to Britain created greater unease amongst the political elites and the far right, culminating in new pieces of legislation, which we know to be the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, and then the one of 1968, and the Immigration Act of 1971, whose aim was to stem the flow of migration from the Black and Brown Commonwealth. Because at the same time with that piece of legislation, we see further rights being given to people from the white Commonwealth who may have had a grandparent or an ancestor who was born in Britain. Well, that was likely, despite the fact that there were Black people in Britain for hundreds of years prior to the arrival of the Windrush, that was very unlikely to be us. It was more likely to be a white South African or a white Canadian or a white New Zealander, white Australian, that sort of thing. And that piece of legislation gave more rights to them and took away rights from people from India, Africa, and so on. What is interesting about that period is that politicians and anti-migrant activists were talking about Britain's indigenous population needing to be saved from a migrant threat, despite the fact that Britain itself is built on being a nation of migrants. We go back to the Jutes, the Roman times, etc. Then we fast forward to the hostile environment, both its informal iteration under Thatcher's Conservatives and its formal development, ironically, as a policy under Blair's Labour, and its purpose. Its purpose is ostensibly to curb illegal migration. The mythology and ideology of borders aside, most of us will probably agree that there ought to be some sort of framework for migration and immigration. But when you look at the facts, none of the laws or policies have really been about these frameworks. They are instead about two things: keeping Britain white and winning elections, so maintaining power. And the strategy works. Margaret Thatcher had a surprise victory at the polls in 1979, following her interview in Granada TV's World in Action programme, I believe it was called, in 1978, in which she said, if we went on as we are then, by the end of the century, there would be 4 million people of the new Commonwealth or Pakistan here. Now, that is an awful lot. And I think it means that people are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. She went on to say that politicians must deal with people's fears, but actually stopped saying what those fears are. And then we saw in 2007, Liam Byrne, who was Labour's minister with responsibility for immigration, announce a series of policies intended to create a much more hostile environment for undocumented migrants. And in fact, what that did instead was to snare in people who were lawfully here, i.e. those described as being of the Windrush generation. And it was this Labour policy, which is why I'm quite surprised everyone gets quite excited that we have a Labour government now and we're seeing all these really dreadful things. It was this Labour policy that actually acted as a precursor to Theresa May's formalisation of this, and the Conservatives putting this policy, so that was Theresa May as Home Secretary, and the Conservatives putting this policy into their manifesto in 2010, during which we saw a whole-scale rewriting of laws that affected families and workers and students. And most of you will remember that very dreadful operation called Operation Vacan, where we saw vans parading around parts of the UK where black and brown people live, particularly in areas where Asian people live, ordering people to go home or face arrest, frightening them to leave voluntarily. And we also saw the start and the increase of deportation charters to countries like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Nigeria, and Jamaica. And of course, there are some to some other countries and European countries too, Albania now. But the whole point of that, again, is keeping Britain white and winning elections. And so what we're seeing now is more of this. Interestingly, one of the reasons why we see so much attrition towards Albanians, who in the main are white people, Europeans, though not in the EU, is because over half of its population are Muslim. And so perhaps in addition to keeping Britain white, we should probably add keeping Britain white and Christian, even though the traditional churches are mostly empty. So none of us should be surprised that Starmer and Labour are mimicking both Enoch Powell and the far right, as encapsulated by reform on the one hand, but sinister think tanks and media commentators and influencers on the other hand. Starmer's statement about the UK becoming an island of strangers was no surprise, because all he's wanting to do is keep Britain white and win his elections. He wants to stay in power. And because one of the things racists hate more than the harm they cause is being called racist, these parties front load their home departments, their home affairs departments with black and brown faces at all levels, with the top level featuring people like Sajid Javid, Priti Patel, Swala Braverman, James Cleverly, and now we've got Mahmood. And it's almost as if cynicism and gaming weren't really a thing. So what we have are political parties offering Britain a road down nostalgia, a Britain that is white. Though I say that's what the politicians want, they want this more because they think this is what the electorate want, and more than really being concerned about who comes and goes from the UK. Because at one extreme, the people in positions of power and authority know this country needs migrants at all levels. It needs to increase its labour force, that families should be protected, be that through asylum, family reunion rights, or making it easier for partners and children to join their loved ones who are British or settled here. They know all of this, but they think that the British public can be swayed to believe all of this in an extreme that the numbers of black and brown people coming into the UK is an extremely bad thing, and that they will be marginalized, that their culture, with no hint of embarrassment in being able to define that culture, will disappear, that we risk becoming a caliphate governed by Sharia law, and so on. That you're all very familiar with the story. And the struggle is confusing, because I hear people of the Windrush generation, without a hint of irony, say things like, well, at least black people are getting a break now. It's the Muslims' turn thereafter, or the people coming in the boats. So instead of solidarity, we end up with a myopic and perverse understanding of history and the realpolitik. And this is what the state and those aligned to various points of view know only too well. And without patronizing a white protester outside a hotel housing asylum seekers or the Windrush elder, the demonizing of migrants has worked so well that migrants themselves have become part of the problem. We laughed at the interviews of black people dressed in the colours of the Union Jack on the Race Hate March, because the media singled them out for interviews a couple Saturdays ago. But we laughed nervously, as we know fully well that without solidarity across large groups, race and class and interests, we cannot win this onslaught, not just on migrants, but on us all. But I want, Nadine touched on the European Convention on Human Rights, but I want to touch on it briefly. We have two main parties, Reform and the Conservatives, wanting to take us out of the convention. Labour has said it won't, but they're also itching to do the same thing if they thought they could get away with it. And they waffle on, including David Blunkett the other day came in kind of left field, going on about coming out of Article, getting out of Article 8 and staying in the rest of it as though that were possible. And I think that Labour's posturing around the European Convention of Human Rights is a precursor to where they really want to be, which is a place more sinister. And what is particularly galling about the debate on the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as you know, was based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that Britain was a signatory to this important declaration. And though it protects the rights of us all, very few journalists are willing or able to seriously hold those who condemn it or who want to extricate us from it to account. Reform, Conservatives, and even Labour will have you and me and the rest of the country believe that leaving the ECHR will stop the small boats arriving across the channel and help the UK deport what it calls foreign criminals. That the ECHR has absolutely nothing to do with asylum seeking is neither here nor there. You seldom hear a journalist ask how leaving the ECHR will address the issue of small boats. So the population is hearing nonsense all the time without challenge. And even with Section 40 of the Nationality and Borders Act, of the 2022 Act, which Nadine touched on, which has created new criminal offences for people arriving in the UK without valid entry clearance or an ETA, including actually people intercepted in international waters, thus criminalising the act of claiming asylum in the way that the Refugee Convention of 1951 permits. You do not hear journalists who are an important channel of communication. They are able to temper the mood and pull it back in from the far right. And there's no responsibility and no holding of the people who commentate and who spout all the nonsense to account. The International Organization of Migration records that there are over 120 million people displaced around the world. The vast majority of these are in countries that have greater economic challenges than the UK. The vast majority are in Africa and Asia. Colombia has taken in 2.5 million Venezuelans who have been forced to leave due to the crippling economic sanctions imposed by the US. Bangladesh has taken in over 1 million Rohingyas. Iran has nearly 4 million refugees, Turkey over 3 million, and few journalists rebut the accusation that people could seek asylum in France or Germany. I get asked this every time I appear in the media. Why can't people? Germany has almost 3 million refugees, with France at just under 1 million. At the end of 2024, the UK has just over 500,000 refugees, and we get less than 100,000 people a year seeking asylum. We're the fifth largest economy. So we can cope. We are a signatory to important international conventions. We should be doing more. This whole idea that we're being swamped, that we can't cope. There's the visibility of people in boats and men in boats and so forth. But we have the responsibility to break these numbers down and try as far as we can, or as much as we can, to educate people. And what the journalists and thought leaders don't ask, what is the real role of the ECHR? The ECHR, the convention, does more for Britain than it does for asylum seekers in both a pervasive and non-pervasive way. I mean, the right to life, which just recently gave us the Hillsborough Law, came from the convention. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, the right to private life, the right to same-sex marriages, all of these things have come from the convention. Very few asylum seekers ever get anywhere needing to use the convention. And the move to curb successful appeals against deportation is equally a nonsensical distortion. That there are significant issues with the deportation of people who have lived in the UK most of their life, some were even born here, some came as children, aside, we don't have time to deal with that today, but this is something that is extremely wrong. We should be campaigning to have this stopped. Very, very few people who are facing deportation use human rights legislation. About 180 people a year, that's the average, taking the data from 2015 up to about a year ago. About 180 people win their deportation appeals, and about half of those rely on Article H, which seems to have become this bogey word for allowing everyone to remain in the country. So the current debate is divorced from reality. I think my 20 minutes is up, so I'm just going to whiz through a couple more points. So the current debate is divorced from reality. The government knows it won't stop the boats, and they know its impact on deportation is negligible, but they are prepared to sacrifice the rights of 70 million people because it might enable another 20 or 30 people to be deported. How perverse is this? Now, Farage took us out of the EU and will no doubt take us out of the European Convention on Human Rights. If he continues on his current trajectory, he or Reform, if he's not there, is very likely to win the next election or be in a coalition with some ghastly organisation, possibly the DUP. The nostalgia being promised by the politicians is powerful. The right and the left has a checkered history on immigration, as positioned by Conservative and Labour thinking, but even as manifested by the trade union movement, with migrant workers, including the Windrush generation of workers, being accused of taking jobs and driving down wages and conditions. Political debate has become divorced from the true needs of the people, of a vision for Britain that could be sustainable, be driven by technology and by culture, which is strengthened because of its diversity. And instead, what we have are politicians and others pitting our communities against each other, destroying families. Nadine talked about the laws that are, and the policies that are likely to change through the white paper. So I'm going to skip over that. But in a masochistic way, destroying the very fabric of some of the very good things about Britain. And it will get worse. I don't suspect Badenoch is likely to get anywhere near being Prime Minister, but she today is talking about drag squads and an ICE-style operation mimicking Trump. Farage will probably take us out of every international convention that protects our rights and is threatening to be able to undo the legitimate immigration status people have, looking back to see how people got their status and removing. We have not been here before. Increasing the time it will take people to settle, providing further curbs on the rights to have your dependents here or family members join you. Increasing the numbers of deportations that will go. How they plan to do that when the system is as it is, it's extremely draconian. Nobody knows, but people don't care because nobody asks the questions. How are you really going to do it? Badenoch said this morning, we are going to reduce or get rid or deport rather a further 160,000 people. There aren't that many people to be deported, but journalists don't question it. We see this, or rather we already operate in a hostile environment with an inefficient Home Office, which makes errors, which is slow, which is inflexible, which is expensive. Nadine talked about the costs of the immigration health surcharge, the cost of fees, the cruelty with things like no recourse to public funds, and it's sometimes chaotic. We see this across its services, including Windrush, but also asylum, immigration and deportation. The appellate courts are bogged down and under-resourced in the same way that courts are under-resourced across the system. We are already in chaos. If we factor in ideology of far-right thinkers, if we try to mimic what is happening in the US, all of us, not just migrants, are likely to be in an unbelievably bad place for an exceptionally long time. So we are in a crisis situation. There are excellent organisations across the UK seeding to provide support to asylum seekers and refugees, and we should be supporting them as much as we can. We should be involved in mass education. Recently, we saw the demonstrations outside the hotel in Epping, and I was asked to do quite a lot of media interviews after that. And, you know, and a lot of it at a local level, Essex Radio, Epping Today or something like that it was called. And one of the things I decided to do was to go and look at some data about crime and statistics in Epping. And I found that there had already been 308 violent crimes committed in Epping this year alone, of which 40, and the Ministry of Justice said 40, the local police said 42, so thereabouts, were of a violent and sexual nature. And, yet I couldn't find anywhere where the people of Epping, whether there was a women's organisation talking about violence against women, where there was any sort of, local initiative to stem violence in the area, but they were very concerned about this one man who had been arrested, had rightly gone through the criminal justice system, has now been convicted. And so that told us that that's not what it was about at all. It was simply a racist overture, mostly managed by people who had come into Epping from outside of the area, to make a point. Nobody there seemed very much concerned about the other 308 violent offences. And we must educate ourselves with this information, the data, the statistics, some of it which Nadine just gave you. Do the research, because when you talk to people on a one-to-one, you do get them to think. We need to point out that all that is happening is that people are being extremely racist. They want to keep Britain white, and people want to stay in power for whatever reason they want to stay. It's in power. And people don't like the truth, because after I made that point on BBC Essex, I got a very nice long letter from a racist who told me where to go and all that sort of thing. But I get those all the time, so they don't necessarily bother me anymore. But it's also, we're all under attack. You'll be under attack. You saw that hacked awful thing that just happened. That's us and our messages and what we're trying to do to combat the right wing, to combat even our government, to combat this atrocious attack on our rights, all our rights. The attack on the rights of migrants is an attack on all of us. The far right is well resourced and they have comrades, and we need to be equally organised. Caribbean Labour Solidarity has been brilliant in trying to raise these issues, and that's brilliant. And we need a lot more of that, because our work is hard, and it's made hard by the fact that we don't control anything. We don't control the media. We don't control any platforms, any social media platforms. And we see how the algorithms and everything are skewed to keep our voices down. We ought to be supporting each other if people have social media platforms. We need to get that message out there and to get it across. And we need to speak to our neighbours, to friends. And as I said, I hear people in the Windrush community saying the most dreadful things about people coming across in the boats. So we have our work cut out for us. And I don't think that we can really expect there to be any change unless we take this seriously as a full-time job, because it's not just about migrants. It's about everything. It's about everything that affects working people, that affects non-white people, and that includes what the sort of stuff we're seeing coming from the Home Office on policing, stop and search, education, local authority, provision of services, etc. We are in crisis, and I salute Luke and his comrades at Caribbean Labour Solidarity for continually wanting to address these issues through an educative forum, but also in actually going beyond that and taking your banner out on the streets, because, this is a struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was brilliant. And thanks to Nadine as well. I'll invite people for questions in a moment, but I just wanted to reflect on some of the things you said. They were so important, especially around the Windrush. We held a meeting before the lockdown on the Windrush scandal. And one of the things I said at that meeting was this inhumane treatment of people from the Caribbean that the government was able to enact with a hostile environment. could only have happened because of the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean. We were seen as chattel, had no rights, no family rights. It's not surprising that they think it's quite okay to just, not make it possible for families to come to this country to join us. And there was one exception. I just a bit funny because I've got family in Guyana that I've never been able to invite because you got to meet so many different requirements for them to get here. But since we found out, we've become Britain's best friend. Visa free now. People can come from Guyana. I was able to invite a niece and a nephew to come and spend some time. So it's very cynical the way this government operates. And we know from their own records that almost every institution in this country has been declared institutionally racist. As people make up with those institutions, racism is very deep in the country because of the enslavement of Africans. It's one of the reasons why we're focusing on the movement for reparations. And I must applaud some of the trade unions that have really given us good support and at a very high level. Our latest brochure we've put out was supported by RMT. We continue to work with them. And also with Unison and things. So there's some hope that some of the union leaders are beginning to take the issue of racism seriously and are supportive of the fight for reparations. What we need to do in CLS is to get more people on the streets when we need them, because the only action and the only time we can show opposition is by getting out there and opposing the draconian measures that they look to bring in. Recently, transport workers have been told to leave, came here legally, working, and because the government has raised the threshold of how much certain workers need to be earning for them to stay or to have a work permit, they're below that threshold, so they've been sent letters telling them that they must leave. People with young families just trying to, came legally, as I said, and did everything right, and being asked to leave. Well, we had our banner out, CLS, couple of us, we went to the Home Office, picketed, joined with those workers, joined with the trade unions. We need more people. So I'm again appealing to people who are on this chat, who are on this Zoom meeting now. If you live in London or near, and you can come, please drop us a line and say you're happy to come and join us on demonstrations, because sometimes, in a short notice, we need to get as many people on the streets as possible. So it'll be good for us to know who can and can't come. We will continue to fight this racism in this country, and we'll join with the support of the organizations that have been doing this for generations, and I keep applauding their efforts. And we will work together. Well, that was a long speech, more than a question to you, Jackie, but or to Nadine. So I'll give people a chance to come in with questions now. I see a couple of hands: Stephen Howard, then Steve Cushion, and then Tony Conway. We'll take them. We'll take the three questions or comments, and then either you, Jackie, or Nadine can reply to them. Thanks, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brother Chair. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Greetings. I'd like to make a comment more than ask questions about this extremely informative and fantastic presentation. You deserve a resounding standing ovation. My simple comment is this. When Europe wanted to build their societies, they went into nations and captured, kidnapped people to bring into the economies, which are now superpowers, without any kind of compensation. Now that folks are coming to these nations because of the atrocious societies based on the exploitation, now that people are coming to these nations to earn an income, all of a sudden they're not welcome. So first off, we bring you here, have you do our labor for free, Now that you want to come so that you could earn an income, all of a sudden you are undesirables. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Steve, you want to put your comment or question?
I was just going to say, and I see my my comrade Carol Vincent here as well, but in Leytonstone, where I live, there was a bit of a rash of these red crosses on roundabouts and a few flags going up and that sort of thing. Very quickly, people went out with a paint and got rid of them. And some comrades set up a WhatsApp group of Leytonstone against racism. Very quickly, that had 550 people on that. We raised £2,500 in 3 days, and there've been posters. You see one behind me there. Leytonstone says no to racism. They're in shops down the high street. Even one of the pubs has got one up. People have got them in their home windows. It's been really kind of quite a positive experience, a positive rejection of that. Neighbouring areas, there's now people asking for Wanstead against racism, South Woodford against racism, and so on. And even when they hung some union flags over the motorway, the Member of Parliament, of whom I'm not entirely an admirer, immediately got the council to come and take them down. For once did his job. And I think that this, sort of shows that if people do, respond, and the response came from all sections of the community, if you will, I think that was extremely positive. My favourite in some ways was this woman who said that well, when I saw the flags go up, I went down to Wickes, bought an 8-foot pole, put a hook on the top of it, sharpened it up, and woof, they were gone. So I mean, I think there's hope in this as well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can I just say something to that question,
Yeah.
to that comment, Luke? And thank you to the first Steve for your points. You're absolutely right. But to Steve Cushion, yeah, I absolutely. I mean, you see the most heartening things around the country, and I go around the country, working with asylum seekers, and it almost in every area, there's a church hall or a community centre that's been taken over, often by sort of elderly white women who are running projects to make asylum seekers welcome, supporting them even after they've become refugees, and that's really heartening. But at the same time, our politicians do really believe that people are racist, that everyone's racist. I don't necessarily think that that's the case at all. And your example and examples we see are evidence of this. But there is something structurally wrong somewhere if somebody like Nigel Farage can be doing so well in the polls, and I don't know whether that's going to continue or whether anyone's got a more sophisticated understanding of what's really going on there, and is it a glitch? But it's extremely worrying, despite the fact that, yes, and with every single struggle, whether it's been the anti-apartheid struggle, my own involvement in Grenada with the Committee for Human Rights, it has been white people who have come forward and supported those struggles. So, this isn't a thing about saying, all white people are racist, but there is something really wrong across society at the moment, and it's being exploited. Because I also don't think, for the reason why I made the point about not wanting to patronise the protester outside the Epping Hotel, or even the elderly Windrush person who made those really awful comments, is that, we all of us in this room can sometimes get a little bit snooty and think, oh, people are just stupid, they don't know better. And, because we've read a book or two. And I don't, because in some of the social media responses to some of the racism, you see Black people saying to people, you need to go and read a book, or you need to go and read this particular book. And it's kind of nonsense, really. Everyone is capable of internalizing these things and understanding them, whatever their level of education or involvement in activism or political movements, etc. But somehow the state political parties, the media is pulling some sections of society along with it. And that's what we have to confront.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder, Jackie, because with the media, it's almost, if we would notice for the last number of months, almost the lead story by the BBC, by other outlets, is on immigration. They're creating and sustaining this issue, which you rightly pointed out, is minuscule as comparison to the other issues that are really facing this country: lack of housing, lack of employment in some ways, rivers that are stinking. And, you know, there are many issues they can be looking at, but race is the lazy one to go to for elections. And it's because, again, because of slavery, because of 500 years of misinformation that they've given to white people and encourage white supremacist kind of thinking that is very deep there and at different levels. You know, the fascists will come out and hurt us because they're just terrible thugs. But other people do have, you know, some inkling of racism, but mostly, you know, it's just a feeling, or they won't take any action to harm people. But I think for some people, they can easily re-stimulate those feelings. Is why often these politicians run to race when they think it's election time. Tony, and then Joseph, and then Nadine.
Thanks, Luke. And I first of all thank Nadine and others who have come in so far during a very difficult situation in terms of that. And obviously, Jackie spoke very forcibly and was interrupted twice by far-right operators. As you said, comrades, it's not the first time it's happened, and no doubt it won't be the last. I just want to say on 3 areas very quickly. I think the threshold issue and the potential, well, the actual dismissing without the right of appeal of RMT, and also PCS members, by the way, is something that we can use to persuade the trade union movement to take immigration regulations much more seriously. Most people were shocked when I told them that they had no right of appeal to employment tribunals. And we must use that as an opportunity now, yes, with the RMT, but also with the wider trade union movement, and get them support changes to regulations governing that. On the question of Reform UK, I've spoken to a number of Reform UK voters and activists. They would consider themselves something like 32% of the population would consider voting for reform. And Jackie quite rightly asked the question, how do we stop that? Well, we have to realise that means that 70% won't vote for reform. However, that 70% vote, Luke, is actually split across a range of political parties. And therefore, to beat them in the election polls, we've got to genuinely think now about forming some form of united stroke popular front to challenge their views. And that's going to be difficult for some people, but we've got to think seriously about that, particularly as Jackie and Nadine said, the Labour Party are as racist or equally as racist as other political parties, but just keep that very quiet indeed. And my third point is about local actions. I now live in quite a strange area, really, called Cornwall, which we count ourselves another nation. We don't get to London very often. It takes 6 hours to do so by train. But in fact, 27 councillors got elected from Reform. But what we've done down here over the last few months is we had a meeting last week, of which we had 40 to 50 people turn up for Black History Month. And we talked about why people were slaves, what happened in Cornwall during that period, and people came away enthused in terms of that. And we will be organising another meeting about immigration regulations. So not just talking to ourselves, but talking to people who don't really agree what we're saying, but willing to take that forward. So local action is absolutely the key in changing the mindset on this particular point. Thanks very much, comrade.
Thank you there, Tony. Nadine, I shall give you the chance to come in now to respond to anything or to, I see your hand is up. Nadine, I was calling on.
Okay. I wanted to say a couple of things. Completely agree with what Jackie said, and also on the local action. I do some work with the Muslim Welfare House, which does a huge amount of work, not just with Muslim community, but local communities, from food to immigration advice. They have a lot of local workers who go out into the community. But I think I really agree we have to have a range of different community actions, because most of those people are not going to go on a demonstration just because they're too scared now, and they're just sitting targets, but they are very interested in what's happening and are having discussions. So I think it's good to have a range of community meetings that people can give us their experiences, even though they are not at the moment willing to take the risk of going out. And the level of fear, especially amongst women at the Muslim Wealth House, is incredibly high. I'd also, Jackie touched on this. I mean, what the British government is playing is the old divide and rule tactic, which I know only too well as an Irish person. And of course, the Irish do still suffer from settler colonialism and divide and rule. And it's something which has been done. And I think some of the rise of reform is to do with being manipulated into divide and rule. And that's why we have to really make sure that we do talk to them, as was said by Tony. Our neighbours who have views that we completely disagree with, we need to talk to them. Some of them may be mistaken. Some of them may not understand what's happening. Some of them may, and I mean, I personally don't speak to the DUP very much, but I think the work in the community is really important. If anybody's been to Northern Ireland, you'll know that the DUP and the other loyalists use flags and album up really effectively to intimidate communities. And in Northern Ireland, it's been really important to have very, very local, street by street response to that. And there also, there is actually an act which deals with flags and album. It may be that we should start to campaign here for such legislation, which does actually at least make people understand the illegality of trying to. In Northern Ireland now, in the lawless areas, you not only see the Union Jack and St George's flag, you see the Israeli flag, you see the Paras flags, and it's all designed to really, really intimidate, and it does intimidate people, especially people trying to live, without thinking about religion. So I think that'd be good to try and do some campaigning and perhaps learn a few lessons from people who are trying to work in a very hostile environment in Northern Ireland. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine. Joseph.
Yeah, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm sorry that I came on late because of problem in connecting. Thanks, Steve, for sending the connection and the information. But so I only came in when Jackie was speaking, and I really agree with all that she said. And most of the time when she speaks, I mean, not all the time, she always speaks truth. But I'm concerned about, I wonder, especially Jackie, what she thinks about Trump's rumbling at the UN, in which he seems to give the signal for an international sort of coalition of, you might say that, I'm trying to use my own words, where he said, for instance, Europe have been invaded. And we are trying to say that we are doing much better than them by curbing immigration or illegal, whatever they call it. At the same time, that is happening. You have in the Caribbean, particularly with the Dominican Republic, the treatment of Haitian people. I mean, it's almost, I mean, I can't even find words to say how I feel about the treatment of the Haitian people out of the Dominican Republic. Is that, is it not a time that we look at it also from an international point of view, what is happening in South Africa, and also to develop a spirit, a sense of solidarity with people who are affected all over the world, I mean, using immigration as a tool to intimidate, ordinary people. Thank you. I hope I'm clear.
Yes, thank you, Joseph. Jackie, you want to respond?
Well, Trump's speech at the, I don't know, I could, I'm sure there's someone somewhere doing a PhD on Trump's speech at the UN somewhere. But I mean, to me, it was just the ramblings of a sort of madman, really. But with some significance, because Joseph's absolutely right. It has a major implication for the rest of the world in that he's influential and people listen. And there is no doubt that people are looking at how popular his ideas are with the rank and file in the States, and people like Badenoch and Farage and so on. And they will try to mimic it. I mean, just today we hear, as I said in my presentation, that Badenoch was speaking about, you know, having an equivalent of ICE and something she calls a drag squad, which I suppose means dragging people off the ground. But in terms of what everyone else has said about local action, local activism, speaking to neighbours and so forth, that it's important to do that, because I don't think anybody believes that Trump is being effective. He's being awful, fascist, and also communities are frightened. I know a lot of the Caribbean communities. I've just literally come back from Grenada a couple of days ago, and you know, I was speaking to lots and lots of people who have relatives in the States who all went up post the invasion of Grenada and have remained undocumented, and now they've stopped going to work and they don't go out shopping, and you know, there's fear. It's fair, but it's not effective in doing anything other than that. It's not reducing numbers, if that's what the Americans who support Trump want to have, the MAGA lot, if that's what they want to see is the numbers reduce, then it's not doing that. You know, they're effectively getting out the same numbers of people that they could get out through legitimate means and not smashing through the Constitution. And just quickly on Haiti, Joseph, yeah, I mean, the treatment of Haitians everywhere is abysmal. Just last year, some Haitians turned up in a boat in Grenada and on a flight actually, and were denied due process. The immigration officers didn't speak French, they didn't speak English, and they were just put on a plane and sent back out, and they were asylum seekers. And Grenada is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, so they should have at least have gotten them an interpreter. There's lots of people in Grenada who speak French. They could have availed themselves of somebody and should have gone through due process. But the Haitians, I mean, the Jamaicans speak poorly of the Haitians. Everybody does. It's a problem that, you know, CARICOM has been trying to grapple with it in terms of the violence and the gangs and so forth, but their people are unwanted everywhere. And the Dominican Republic leads that. Well, the States leads it. Dominican Republic experience is awful. It has always been awful. The Dominican Republics have seen themselves as the lighter skin, mulatto favored people, with the Haitians being sort of what they call more negroid. And so again, racism, extreme racism. And what's interesting there is not only does that island of Santo Domingo see racism from the people, the lighter skinned people who just happen to inhabit half of it against the darker skinned people on the other half, but we also see it throughout CARICOM, where those governments, and with the exception of a couple, but generally speaking, the governments and more importantly, the people do not want Haitians coming there. So it's all well and good when, you know, we talk about racism in Europe, but there is a major problem with, and the States, but we also, those of us, it's Caribbean Labour Solidarity, so those of us from the CARICOM region or with heritage there must realise that we also have a significant problem with how we treat our brothers and sisters in the region.
Thank you, Jackie. One of our big issues for Caribbean Labour Solidarity is Haiti. We haven't done anything recently. We've, over the last couple of years, picketed the Canadian Embassy, other places, Dominican Republic agents, embassy as well. But we need to be taking more action, and especially that the way in which we see the Haitians are being treated in the Caribbean. As you rightly said, Jamaica, Guyana as well, deported or imprisoned, you know, people, despite CARICOM saying, you know, that people should be welcomed in the different countries in the region. But we see the Haitians being picked on. and we need to keep struggling. You know, we all Haiti a lot. You know, the first country in the world to actually throw off the shackles of slavery. You know, the first successful slavery revolution, and we know they're being punished for that by the Western world. France daring to turn up 25 years after they were defeated with gunboats that threatened to blow up the ports unless they paid reparations. You know, this is why the reparations, and as you rightly said earlier, Jackie, education is key really to everything that we do, because many people don't understand slavery and the legacy that we are still suffering from slavery. And I think the reparations movement gives us the opportunity to look at it in detail, find out more. There's so much being written. There's so many books coming out on it. And it's an exciting area to be studying, I think, and every Caribbean person really should be looking at it. We need to be forming those groups in the Caribbean where people can meet and discuss and talk about it. And I don't know how many of those groups are happening, but reparations is key to educating people in the Caribbean about their African heritage, something which we've been taught to despise or to feel that we are better than, you know, and people need to look at that. Okay, I got two hands up in the air. Sharon, do you want to take the floor?
Yes, I do. Thank you, first of all. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Great stuff. I want to say a huge thank you to Nadine, Jacqueline, and all of you comrades. My first time on this platform, while everybody was speaking, I made sure I sourced the Caribbean Labour Solidarity website, and I've joined, and I'm now going to join as a member, number one. And I'm ashamed to say that I wasn't even really aware of the work you've done. It's quite sterling. I was thinking about from the perspective of organizing. And by the way, Carol, you might not remember me. I met you some 900 years ago in East London when I was delivering genealogy and family history. My background is community organizing, genealogy and family history, by the way. And what I did in the very beginning, some years ago in my borough, is help to set up what's called a Refugees Welcome Committee and targeted various statutory services and making sure and other services and sectors to pull things together for the community that had arrived through the Syrian crisis at the time, as you're all aware of that. I believe in terms of what we could do as a solution, you all mentioned it already, is looking at organizing from a perspective of, and Jackie's right, it's doing those hyper-local level organizing, having those deep listening to really understand what the situations are, and now that those dialogue will invariably, and what tends to happen in my experience is that in having those local dialogues, it builds to something bigger. People don't see it as threatening, but if it's more on a dialogic perspective, then it will bring in people's it will tend to people's issues and concerns tend to emerge, because through that we're looking at because what we tend to do is look at a conduct listening exercise, which is really deep level listening as opposed to shallow level listening, looking at power and understanding what that means to individuals, and do power mapping, and which is what a lot of the things I do is power mapping and analysis, and then help bring people together. Yes, the way I work is very hyperlocal. I'm a bit bad in not promoting it outwardly. I think what I might have to start doing is promoting that process outwardly, so that we have models of good practice in terms of developing that listening around the issues that we're talking about here right now on this platform. I've got to shout out to Glenda Caesar, who kindly responded to my concern about a local resident that I'm working with right now. So yeah, I'd like to input and try to support in as best as a possible way I can in terms of challenging all these social injustices. So aware of what you've just said there, Luke, about and it's a theory I've held about Haitian community has been punished for being so, I guess, avant-garde about how they supported the African diasporan cause all those centuries ago. And we do need to support them collectively as best as we possibly can. I also think about the young people I work with and how they are very remote and distant from their culture and heritage, and that balance is being currently redressed, albeit at a hyper local level. So I think where there are good examples, we need to shout about it and bring it around. I mean, the work that you're doing, Carol, Vincent, and Steve Cushion, from what I'm reading, that we need to get that more out there and develop some good models of practice so that we can support other communities to build and grow a massive collective voice and build a really powerful. They can't really challenge. I mean, yes, they will challenge. The system will challenge, but the more power we have, it will put a really good, powerful base to form some healing and addressing the social injustices that we are experiencing right now. So I hope that makes sense what I've just said.
Perfect sense, Sharon, and thank you for joining. Please drop me a line through the website so we can have a conversation about the work that you do.
You're
It
very,
links up
very welcome.
with what we do. So please.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, we got a couple more questions. I think Audrey West and then Joseph. Audrey, you want to take the floor?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for organising this conference and all the input. A lot of it is more information for me and very enriching, but also very saddening to see the way that we have been, what's the word, attacked, for want of a better word. But I'm speaking on the basis of the figures, and I'm not, in general, I'm not a measurer and a counter, and I appreciate people who do. One of the things I looked at when I was looking at my father's coming to the UK, because I didn't know the narrative, I looked at the National Archives and the numbers of boats coming in between 1959, let's say summer 59 to December 1960, because I knew he would have come in between those dates. And the numbers of boats coming from the Caribbean were minuscule, one or two boats. And most of the boats, and there were loads of boats coming in post-war, they were from Canada, from South Africa, and from Australia, incoming people to this country post-war. And I've often wanted to measure those figures, but as I said, I'm not a measurer in lots of ways, and I'd love someone to do that research because all the evidence is there. We were a smattering of people, and they made it as if we're the few people who came into this country at that time. So please, could someone take it on the basis of what other people have said, saying about getting our numbers together? This is just another source I'd like someone to look at, not me, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your comment.
I'm
sure somebody will take you up on that, Audrey. Thank you so much.
Can I just say, Audrey, that the figures of people who are described as having come on the boats, and also that it's kind of weird, isn't it? In the same way that the Windrush boat was not the first boat, there was two boats before it. In that sort of, and we know there were people here for hundreds of years. I have to keep saying that because I keep hearing Professor Gus John in the back of my head telling me stop this nonsense about black people came here on the Windrush because we were here for hundreds of years. So that haunts me actually because he tells me off the whole time about that. But in terms of the Windrush era, it's an era and it's worthy of note as a particular era. It's supposed to be 500,000 people. And a lot of them, like my own mother, came on the BOAC plane. And it also includes part of the next generation. So what we call the barrel children who are left behind and sent here. So it's about 500,000. And what's interesting now, if you look at the census data from 2021 and also 2011, the numbers of people who regard themselves of having Caribbean heritage in particular is so small, really, really small. And that's mainly because of the 1971 Act, which actually closed the door. So people leaving the Caribbean mostly go to the States or to Canada or to other Caribbean islands, but hardly anybody comes here unless they're coming as a partner or as a student, really. And there's been some initiatives like nurses and teachers and so on coming in from some of the islands. But generally, after 1971, well, in fact, after the 1st of January 1973, the door closed.
Yes, thanks for that, Jackie. And we got one other question. Hold on, I lost Joseph.
Yeah, I think Jackie and you mentioned, first of all, I want to support all that has been said by everybody so far. And I think Jackie mentioned education and you mentioned it also. but I want to include the idea of, the issue of attitude. Jackie mentioned about the deportation of Haitians from Grenada. I spoke to one high official in the government subsequent to that, and he told me that their hands are tied because that's the law, blah, blah, blah. But if he had a chance, he would open the door to Haitians to come in here even much more. There's an attitude, however, on the opposite side that people who think, the few people in Grenada, for instance, who think we should have Haitians, they think about having them come as secondary or secondary citizens, meaning they could come and work cheap labor. So I think the whole issue of attitude, and of course, she mentioned Jamaica, which I'm very familiar with the attitude there towards Haitians. We need to find a way to have it all-encompassing, that people see wherever people are struggling, are suffering, that it should be our concern. So that, for instance, the experience of that our people are facing in US, or even UK, France, wherever now, or even what the Black folks in South Africa are facing, the non-South Africans, that we should be concerned about those things and feel it, have a sense of feeling of solidarity, and not think, well, as these people suffer, and then the propaganda from the media, which continue to affect us in serious way. We need to find a way. But the question is there, can we find a practical way to really help to curb the influence of the Western world on our own attitude? Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. As I mentioned earlier on, we try to put pressure on some of the high commissions or embassies in the UK when people are mistreating Haitians and other people in the region. We need to get busy again with that. Okay, we'll have one more question, and then if Nadine and Jackie can maybe do a closing statement before we wrap up. So now's your chance for that question if you want to put it, because there's no hands up at the moment that I can see, or no questions. Okay. Can we start with you then, Nadine? Just anything you want to say in closing?
Just a couple of things. I pick up on what Tony just said about a lobby of Parliament, because I'm actually working with John McDonnell at the moment. We're working with a group of refugee NGOs, and we've been holding a series of meetings. I have to say that the take up by MPs have been a bit disappointing, but we've got another one coming up at the end of the month. So we're trying to inform a cross-party group of MPs about all the issues, particularly about child migrants, but it is wider than that, and with the big charity. So that's something that's been happening. And as I said before, I think it is really important to be working at hyper-local area level. And that certainly if we do manage to get these leaflets for the Muslim Welfare House, I'm sure they wouldn't mind sharing with other people who want to work in a very local area.
Great, thanks. And we will be organizing around that. Thank you. Jackie, are you there?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Firstly, just to say thanks for some of the comments. I didn't realize the comments was on, actually. I thought we had shut it down because of the hack, but I've just read some of them, and it takes the debate further, some of them. So that's really quite interesting and heartening to read. And also to Joseph, whoever that Grenadian government official was, he simply lied, because Grenada's signatory to the Refugee Convention, so their hands aren't tied. They're meant to give people at least the opportunity to come ashore, give their case, and and process them. And there is an asylum processing system in the region, and it's used often for people from Venezuela. So there's some really bizarre things going on in the region. Somebody from Trinidad and Tobago actually told me that they didn't mind the Venezuelans coming so much because they're attractive. I mean, what on earth is that? So it's horrendous. Everywhere we look, it's horrendous. And I think what I would add and take away from today is something that most of you have said, which is about local activity, local activism. I think that's the best thing that we can all do. We can all use our platforms if we have any. That, as I said, the algorithms kind of shut us down. Whenever I mention the word immigration, nobody sees it. Even when I go onto another platform to look for myself, I don't see it. But if I mention something about, I don't know, carnival or, you know, a pet, then, you know, there's lots of engagement with it. So we know that when we talk about these issues, the powers that be are able to shut us down, as they tried today with the incursion. But I think taking it all to our local levels, doing whatever we can, finding out whether there are support groups in our area, we can get the message out there. We can change people's minds and hearts, and there are lots of people who just want to be given some information. As I think it might have been Nadine who said that people might just be mistaken or not necessarily understand. People don't. I mean, when I've had a conversation with somebody who said to me, "Oh, but they get all the benefits." And when I told them that asylum seekers get £8 a week, £8 a week, they had no idea. Of course, you know, they get some of them get accommodation on top of that, but £8 a week. So we have to demystify the material. We have to put it out there. But I really like the idea of, and I'm not networked into anything local. I haven't seen any flags where I live. It might be because I'm on the edge of Croydon and they're frightened of the Mandem, as they call them. But I haven't seen a single flag. So but anyway, I will look out to see what's going on here and see whether there's something I can do, but we must all do our bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody will join me in applauding you and Nadine and saying what an excellent meeting this was. And so much food for thought and so much action that things we need to action. We look forward to the next period, and I look forward to seeing you all next meeting as usual. And please think about inviting somebody else with you, you know, a neighbor, friend to this Zoom meeting. It's a shame we don't, you know, get this information and this level of discussion to as many people as possible. And thank you all for coming, for joining the meeting. A big thank goes to all who, and especially those that have stayed despite the incursion, as Jackie said, you know. So thank you again, and hopefully next week we don't have